There are fortunes that pass from father to son, dynasties that carry a name forward through generations, bloodlines that keep a legacy alive long after the man who built it is gone. And then there is the story of Gene Autry, a man who started with $8 and a dream so fragile it could have snapped in the Texas heat before it ever had a chance to breathe. A man who built one of the most quietly staggering empires Hollywood ever produced. Television stations, a baseball team, radio networks, real estate stretching across the American West. A fortune that, by the time he closed his eyes for the last time, placed him among the 400 richest people in the entire United States. And yet, when the dust finally settled, when the lawyers had done their work and the world had moved on, there was no son waiting to carry the name. No daughter stepping forward to claim the inheritance. No grandchildren gathering around a table to divide what he had spent a lifetime building. Just a silence where a family should have been. And what filled that silence in the 28 years since his passing is a story most people have never been told properly. But to understand where Gene Autry's legacy ended up, you first have to understand the kind of man he truly was. Not the singing cowboy on the movie poster. Not the smiling face on the baseball program. The real man. The one shaped by hunger and hardship and a childhood that would have broken most people before they ever had the chance to dream. You might think you know his story, but imagine for a moment what it actually felt like to be a 6-year-old boy already working the fields. Not playing, not learning to read, working, because the family needed every coin that small hands could earn. Gene Autry came into this world on September 29, 1907, on a tenant farm in Tioga, Texas, in a part of the country where the land was hard and the future felt harder. His father, Delbert, was a horse trader and a dreamer in the most dangerous sense of the word. The kind of man whose next deal was always just around the corner, always just about to change everything, and almost never did. His mother, Elnora, was frail in a way that settled over the whole household like a permanent shadow. She was sick in the slow, grinding way that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply drains the warmth out of a home one season at a time. And between a father who kept disappearing after failed ventures and a mother who was barely strong enough to hold the family together, young Gene learned something early that most people spend their whole lives trying to unlearn. He learned that security was an illusion, that everything you had could vanish overnight, and that the only thing standing between you and ruin was your own 2 hands. When Delbert ended up in prison around 1918 for bootlegging, Gene was approximately 11 years old. And just like that, the floor dropped out. He became the one doing the heavy lifting. Early mornings, hard hands, the steady, quiet fear of what tomorrow might bring. But here is what the history books tend to skip past too quickly. It was not just poverty that shaped him during those years. It was music. His grandfather, a strict Baptist preacher named William T. Autry, filled the family's world with hymns and hard rules about right and wrong. And in that stern, unforgiving atmosphere, Gene found the one thing that cost nothing and gave everything back: his voice. He sang in church as a small boy. He sang psalms at home with his mother. And those songs got into his bones in a way that no amount of hardship could ever shake loose. Because when everything else was uncertain, music was always there. Always his. By 1919, when he was around 12 years old, Gene had saved exactly $8 from baling hay on his uncle's farm. $8 that he could have spent on food. $8 that represented breathing room for a family that had almost none. He spent it on a guitar from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And that single decision, made by a hungry, tired 12-year-old boy in the Texas heat, quietly changed the course of American entertainment forever. But what the public never fully understood was the psychological weight behind that choice. This was not a boy buying a toy. This was a boy making a bet on himself at a moment when nobody else in his life had ever done the same. It was an act of defiance against every lesson his childhood had tried to teach him. And it would take years before the world understood just how right he was to make it. By his mid-teens, he was earning tips at local cafes and school events. By 17, he had taught himself telegraphy and was earning $30 a month as a railroad operator. sending money back home because his family still needed it, still leaned on him the way they always had. And then one night, somewhere in that quiet stretch of 1926 to 1928, a man walked into the telegraph depot in Chelsea, Oklahoma, and heard a young operator singing softly to himself in the empty station. That man was Will Rogers, already a national name, already a legend. And Rogers listened for a moment, genuinely surprised that a voice like that was wasting itself behind a telegraph machine. He told Gene, simply and directly, that a voice like his belonged on the radio. It seems like such a small thing. A famous man passing through a small town, offering a few words of encouragement. But for a boy who had spent his entire life being told, in one way or another, that his dreams were too big for his circumstances, those words landed like a thunderclap. He chased the dream immediately and failed completely. He went to New York in 1928 with almost nothing and came back with even less. Broke, embarrassed, the kind of failure that makes a person seriously consider giving up. But here is the thing about Gene Autry that his competitors and his critics never quite grasped. Failure didn't stop him. It educated him. He went back to the local dances, back to the small shows, back to the railroad stations and the radio sets and the long, quiet nights of practicing. And by late 1928, he had earned himself a spot on KVO radio in Tulsa, billed as the yodeling cowboy. Crowds of 1,000 people started showing up to his live events. His pay jumped to $50, then $100 a week. And the boy from the Texas tenant farm began to understand, for the very first time, that the bet he had placed on himself at 12 years old was finally starting to pay off. What followed was one of the most extraordinary rises in the history of American entertainment. Films, radio, records. By 1931, that silver-haired daddy of mine had sold 500,000 copies during the darkest years of the Great Depression, because it sounded like longing and loss and love and everything people were carrying quietly inside themselves. By 1934, Hollywood had discovered him. By 1937, he was the #1 box office draw in America, not just in westerns, in all of Hollywood. And yet, even in the middle of all that success, even while the money was flowing and the crowds were cheering, there was a version of Gene Autry that the public never saw. A private man, a complicated man, a man who, despite the clean-cut cowboy image he projected on screen, was living a life with shadows that didn't match the poster. Because while Gene was married to Ina May Spivey, the woman he had eloped with on April Fool's Day in 1932, the woman who pushed him toward Hollywood and convinced him to record Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer against his own doubts, while he was building that respectable, wholesome public image, stories were quietly circulating in Hollywood circles about his relationship with Gail Davis, the woman who starred in Annie Oakley, the woman whose career Gene himself had helped build. The details were never confirmed publicly in his lifetime, but the whispers were persistent enough and specific enough that they followed him for decades. And what made it stranger, what made it a detail that lingers even now, is the contrast. Here was a man who promoted a cowboy code of honor and decency to millions of children. A man whose entire brand was built on doing the right thing, living with a quiet contradiction that only the people closest to him ever truly saw. But we will come back to what all of this meant, because the real revelation about Gene Autry's private life only becomes clear when you see what he left behind. In July of 1942, at the height of his earning power, pulling in roughly $600,000 a year, Gene Autry walked away from all of it and enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He was 35 years old, the maximum draft age. He did not have to go. He was offered comfortable public relations work, the kind of safe, studio-approved patriotism that kept other stars far from danger. He refused. He wanted real flight training, real missions, and he got them. He flew C-109 Liberator tankers over some of the most dangerous air routes of the war, including missions connected to the China-Burma-India theater and the notorious hump route over the Himalayas, where the weather alone had already claimed hundreds of planes and more than 1,000 lives. His monthly pay dropped to $125. The studio immediately started rebuilding around his absence, turning a young singer named Leonard Sly into Roy Rogers and handing him the crown Gene had spent years earning. When Gene came home in 1946, the world had moved on without him. Roy Rogers was on top. The studio still had contractual power over him. And the man who had once been the biggest star in Hollywood had to fight legally and professionally just to reclaim his own name. He fought. He always fought. He broke free from Republic Pictures. He launched his own production company. He bought radio stations. He bought television stations. He bought a baseball team, the Los Angeles Angels, in 1961. He purchased KTLA in Los Angeles for $12 million in 1964 and sold it in 1982 for $245 million. He accumulated real estate and oil wells and hotels and investments that most of his fans never knew existed. And by the time he died on October 2, 1998, just 3 days after his 91st birthday, Forbes magazine had placed him among the 400 wealthiest Americans. The boy who saved $8 to buy a guitar had built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But here is the part that stops you cold when you sit with it long enough. Gene Autry had no children, not with Ina May, his first wife of nearly 48 years, who died of cancer in May of 1980, and not with Jackie Elam, the woman he married 14 months after INA's death on July 19, 1981, in a ceremony that stunned Hollywood. Jackie was 39 years old. Gene was 73. A 34-year age gap that made headlines across the country and raised questions that people whispered but rarely asked out loud. They had met years earlier, in 1964, at a bank in Palm Springs where Jackie had risen from switchboard operator to vice president through sheer determination. Their first date happened around New Year's Eve of 1979, and even then, Gene was so nervous, so uncharacteristically uncertain, that he invited her with the option of bringing a friend along. The singing cowboy who had faced down studio bosses and flown over the Himalayas was terrified of a dinner date. And somehow, that detail is more human and more heartbreaking than anything else in his story. They had no children together either. And that absence, that silence at the center of all that wealth, is the thing that shaped everything which came after. Because when Gene Autry was gone, the question became unavoidable. Where does an empire go when there is no one to inherit it? The answer unfolded slowly over the 28 years since his passing, and it is more meaningful than anyone who only knew the movie posters ever expected. Jackie Autry did not simply grieve and step aside. She became the guardian of everything Gene had built and everything he had believed in. The Autry Foundation, which Gene had established years before his death, became the engine that carried his name forward. Under Jackie's stewardship, the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles grew into one of the most respected cultural institutions in the country, a world-class museum dedicated to preserving the real, complicated, deeply human history of the American West. Not the myth, the truth, which, when you think about it, is exactly what Gene Autry's own story deserved all along. The Los Angeles Angels, the baseball team he had loved and owned for decades, passed to Disney following an agreement Gene himself had arranged in the mid-1990s, knowing he would not live forever and wanting the franchise protected. Fans had rallied around the phrase "win one" for the cowboy during his final years, feeling in some instinctive way that the owner was as much a part of the team's identity as any player. And in 2002, for years after Gene's death, the Angels won the World Series. Whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, it is the sort of detail that makes you pause for a moment. What Gene Autry left behind was not a family dynasty in the traditional sense. There was no son to carry the name into the next generation, no daughter to inherit the foundation. What he left instead was something rarer and, in its own way, more lasting. He left a vision, a museum that tells the story of the West to millions of visitors. A foundation that continues to fund education and cultural preservation. A name attached not to a bloodline, but to a set of values about what it means to build something honest with your own hands and then choose, deliberately, to give it back to the world. And Jackie, the woman 34 years his junior, the woman the headlines reduced to an age gap and a raised eyebrow, turned out to be exactly the right person to carry all of it forward. She understood what Gene had built because she had watched him build it. She understood what he had sacrificed because she had seen what those sacrifices had cost him. And she spent the years after his death making sure that the boy from the Texas tenant farm, the one who saved $8 and bet everything on a guitar, would not be forgotten. 28 years later, the fortune did not disappear into legal battles or family feuds. It became something. It became a legacy that Gene Autry, the real one, the complicated, driven, lonely, extraordinary man behind the cowboy hat, would have been quietly proud of. Because, in the end, he did not just build an empire. He built something that outlasted him. And for a boy who spent his childhood watching everything fall apart, that might have been the only thing he ever truly wanted.